Jewish ethnic divisions refers to a number of distinctive communities within the world's ethnically Jewish population. Although considered one single self-identifying ethnicity, there are distinctive ethnic divisions among Jews, most of which are primarily the result of geographic branching from an originating Israelite population, mixing with local populations, and subsequent independent evolutions. As long ago as biblical times, cultural and linguistic differences between Jewish communities, even within the area of ancient Israel and Judea, are observed both within the Bible itself as well as from archaeological remains. In more recent human history, an array of Jewish communities were established by Jewish settlers in various places around the Old World, often at great distances from one another, resulting in effective and often long-term isolation from each other. During the millennia of the Jewish diaspora, the communities would develop under the influence of their local environments. Political, cultural, natural and populational. Today, manifestation of these differences among the Jews can be observed in Jewish cultural expressions of each community, including Jewish linguistic diversity, culinary preferences, liturgical practices, religious interpretations, as well as degrees and sources of genetic admixture. Historical background. Ancient Israel and Judah. The full extent of the cultural, linguistic, religious or other differences among the Israelites in antiquity is unknown. Following the defeat of the Kingdom of Israel in the 720s BCE and the Kingdom of Judah in 586 BCE, the Jewish people became dispersed throughout much of the Middle East, especially in Egypt and North Africa to the west, as well as in Yemen to the south, and in Mesopotamia to the east. The Jewish population in Palestine was severely reduced by the Jewish-Roman Wars and by the later hostile policies of the Christian emperors, against non-Christians, but the Jews always retained a presence in the Levant. During this period, Paul Johnson writes, wherever towns survived, or urban communities sprang up, Jews would sooner or later establish themselves. The near destruction of Palestinian Jewry in the 2nd century turned the survivors of Jewish rural communities into marginal town dwellers. After the Arab conquest in the 7th century, the large Jewish agricultural communities in Babylonia were progressively wrecked by high taxation, so that there too the Jews drifted into towns and became craftsmen, tradesmen, and dealers. Everywhere these urban Jews, the vast majority literate and numerate, managed to settle, unless penal laws or physical violence made it impossible. In the early Byzantine 6th century, there were 43 Jewish communities in Palestine. During the Islamic period and the intervening Crusades, there were 50 communities which included Jerusalem, Tiberias, Ramleh, Ashkelon, Caesarea, and Gaza. During the early Ottoman period of the 14th century there were 30 communities which included Haifa, Shechem, Hebron, Ramleh, Jaffa, Gaza, Jerusalem, and Safed. The most dominant location became Safed, which reached a population of 30,000 Jews by end of the 16th century, after the expulsion of Sephardim from Iberia, a century earlier. The 16th century saw many Ashkenazi Kabbalists drawn to the mystical aura and teachings of the Jewish holy city. Johnson notes that in the Arab Muslim territories, which included most of Spain, all of North Africa, and the Near East south of Anatolia in the Middle Ages, the Jewish condition was easier as a rule than it was in Europe. Over the centuries following the Crusades and Inquisition, Jews from around the world began emigrating in increasing numbers. Upon arrival, these Jews adopted the customs of the Mizrahi and Sephardi communities into which they moved. With Baron von Rothschild's philanthropic land purchases and subsequent efforts to turn Palestine into a verdant Jewish homeland, and the subsequent rise of Zionism, a flood of Ashkenazi immigration brought the Jewish population of the region to several hundred thousand. Diaspora. Following the failure of the Second Revolt against the Romans and the exile, Jewish communities could be found in nearly every notable center throughout the Roman Empire, as well as scattered communities found in centers beyond the empire's borders in Northern Europe, in Eastern Europe, in Southwestern Asia, and in Africa. Further to the east along trade routes, Jewish communities could be found throughout Persia and in empires even further east, including in India and China. In the early Middle Ages of the 6th to 11th centuries, the Radhanites traded along the overland routes between Europe and Asia earlier established by the Romans, dominated trade between the Christian and the Islamic worlds, and used a trade network that covered most areas of Jewish settlement. In the Middle Byzantine period, the Khan of Khazariah in the northern Caucasus and his court converted to Judaism, partly in order to maintain neutrality between Christian Byzantium and the Islamic world. This event forms the framework for Yehuda Halevi's work The Khazari, but how much these traces of Judaism within this group survived the collapse of the Khazar Empire is a matter of scholarly debate. In Western Europe, following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476, and especially after the reorientation of trade caused by the Moorish conquest of Iberia in the early 8th century, communications between the Jewish communities in northern parts of the former Western Empire became sporadic. At the same time, rule under Islam, even with dhimmi status, resulted in freer trade and communications within the Muslim world, and the communities in Iberia remained in frequent contact with Jewry in North Africa and the Middle East, but communities further afield, in Central and South Asia and Central Africa, remained more isolated, and continued to develop their own unique traditions. For the Sephardim in Spain, it resulted in a Hebrew Golden Age in the 10th to 12th centuries. The 1492 expulsion from Spain by the Catholic monarchs, however, made the Sephardic Jews hide and disperse to France, Italy, England, the Netherlands, parts of what is now northwestern Germany, and to other existing communities in Christian Europe, as well as to those within the Ottoman Empire, to the Maghreb and North Africa, and smaller numbers to other areas of the Middle East, and eventually to the Americas in the early 17th century. In Northern and Christian Europe during this period, financial competition developed between the authority of the Pope and Roman nation-states and empires. This dynamic, with the Great Schism, recurrent fervid religious crusades, episcopal inquisition and later protestations and wars between Christians themselves, caused repeated periods and occurrences of persecution against the established Jewish minority in Ashkenaz. In modern Hebrew means Germanic Jews, and with ancient Hebrew it included the areas that are now northern France, Germany and Switzerland. Masses of Jews began to move further to the east. There, they were welcomed by the King of Poland, and with Lithuania, grew greatly, and relatively flourished to the end of the 18th century. In Western Europe, the conditions for Jewry differed between the communities within the various countries and over time, depending on background conditions. With both pull and push factors operating, Ashkenazi emigration to the Americas would increase in the early 18th century with German-speaking Ashkenazi Jews, and end with a tidal wave between 1880 and the early 20th century with Yiddish-speaking Ashkenazim, as conditions in the East deteriorated under the failing Russian Empire. With the Holocaust and the destruction of most European Jewry, North America would hold the majority of world Jewry. Modern divisions. Historically, European Jews have been classified into two major groups, the Ashkenazim, or Germanics, denoting their Central European base, and the Sephardim, or Hispanics, denoting their Spanish and Portuguese base. A third historic term, Mizrahim, or Easterners, has been used to describe other non-European Jewish communities to the east, but its usage has changed both over time and relative to the location where it was used. A similar three-part distinction in the Jewish community of 16th-century Venice is noted by Johnson as being divided into three nations: the Pennantines from Spain, the Levantines who were Turkish subjects, and the nation Tedesca or Jews of German origin. The far more recent meaning of the term, to include both Middle Eastern and North African Jews in a single term, developed within Zionism in the mid-1940s, when Jews from these countries were all combined in one category as the target of an immigration plan. According to some sources, the current sense of the term, as an ethnic group distinct from European-born Jews, was invented at this time. The term constitutes a third major layer to some, and following the partition of Palestine and Israeli independence, the Mizrahim's often forced migration led to their re-established communities in Israel. Smaller Jewish groups include the Georgian Jews and Mountain Jews from the Caucasus. Indian Jews including the Bnei Israel, Bnei Manash, Cochin Jews and Bnei Ephraim. The Romaniotes of Greece. The ancient Italian Jewish community. The Tiamanim from the Yemen. various African Jews, including most numerously the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, the Bukharan Jews of Central Asia, and Chinese Jews, most notably the Kaifeng Jews, as well as various other distinct but now extinct communities. The divisions between all these groups are rough and their boundaries aren't solid. The Mizrahim, for example, are a heterogeneous collection of North African and Middle Eastern Jewish communities which are often as unrelated to each other as they are to any of the earlier mentioned Jewish groups. In modern usage, however, the Mizrahim are also termed Sephardi due to similar styles of liturgy, despite independent evolutions from Sephardim proper. Thus, among Mizrahim there are Iranian Jews, Iraqi Jews, Egyptian Jews, Sudanese Jews, Tunisian Jews, Algerian Jews, Moroccan Jews, Lebanese Jews, Kurdish Jews, Libyan Jews, Syrian Jews, and various others. The Yemenite Jews from Yemen are sometimes included, although their style of liturgy is unique and they differ in respect to the admixture found among them to that found in Mizrahim. Additionally, there is a difference between the pre-existing Middle Eastern and North African Jewish communities as distinct from the descendants of those Sephardi migrants who established themselves in the Middle East and North Africa after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain by the Catholic monarchs in 1492, and in 1497 from the expulsion decreed in Portugal. Despite this diversity, Ashkenazi Jews represent the bulk of modern Jewry, estimated at between 70% and 80% of all Jews worldwide. Prior to World War II and the Holocaust, however, it was 90%. While Ashkenazim developed in Europe, their massive emigration from Europe for better opportunities, and during periods of civil strife and warfare, they also became the overwhelming majority of Jews in the New World continents and countries, which previously were without native European or Jewish populations. These include the United States, Mexico, Canada, United Kingdom, Argentina, Australia, Brazil and South Africa, but with Venezuela and Panama being exceptions since Sephardim still compose the majority of the Jewish communities in these two countries. In France, more recent Sephardi Jewish immigrants from North Africa and their descendants now outnumber the pre-existing Ashkenazim. Only in Israel is the Jewish population representative of all groups, a melting pot independent of each group's proportion within the overall world Jewish population. Genetic studies Despite the evident diversity displayed by the world's distinctive Jewish populations, both culturally and physically, genetic studies have demonstrated most of these to be genetically related to one another, having ultimately originated from a common ancient Israelite population that underwent geographic branching and subsequent independent evolutions. A study published by the National Academy of Sciences stated that the results support the hypothesis that the paternal gene pools of Jewish communities from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East descended from a common Middle Eastern ancestral population, and suggest that most Jewish communities have remained relatively isolated from neighboring non-Jewish communities during and after the diaspora. Researchers expressed surprise at the remarkable genetic uniformity they found among modern Jews, no matter where the diaspora has become dispersed around the world. Moreover, DNA tests have demonstrated substantially less intermarriage in most of the various Jewish ethnic divisions over the last 3,000 years than in other populations. The findings lend support to traditional Jewish accounts accrediting their founding to exiled Israelite populations, and counters theories that many or most of the world's Jewish populations were founded by entirely Gentile populations that adopted the Jewish faith, as in the notable case of the historic Khazars. Although groups such as the Khazars could have been absorbed into modern Jewish populations in the Khazars case, absorbed into the Ashkenazim it is unlikely that they formed a large percentage of the ancestors of modern Ashkenazi Jews, and much less that they were the genesis of the Ashkenazim. Even the archetype of Israelite origin is also beginning to be reviewed for some Jewish populations amid newer studies. Previously, the Israelite origin identified in the world's Jewish populations was attributed only to the males who had migrated from the Middle East and then forged the current known communities with the women from each local population whom they took as wives and converted to Judaism. Research in Ashkenazi Jews has suggested that, in addition to the male founders, significant female founder ancestry might also derive from the Middle East, with about 40% of the current Ashkenazi population descended matrilineally from just 4 women, or founder lineages, that were likely from a Hebrew Levantine mtDNA pool originating in the Near East in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. Points in which Jewish groups differ are the source and proportion of genetic contribution from host populations. As examples, the Teimanim differ from other Mizrahim, as well as from Ashkenazim, in the proportion of sub-Saharan African gene types which have entered their gene pools. Among Yemenites, the average stands at 35% lineages within the past 3,000 years. Yemenite Jews, as a traditionally Arabic-speaking community of local Yemenite and Israelite ancestries, are included within the findings, though they average a quarter of the frequency of the non-Jewish Yemenite sample. In Ashkenazi Jews, the proportion of male indigenous European genetic admixture amounts to around 0.5% per generation over an estimated 80 generations, and a total admixture estimate around 12.5%. The only exception to this among Jewish communities is in the Beta Israel. A 1999 genetic study came to the conclusion that the distinctiveness of the Y chromosome haplotype distribution of Beta Israel Jews from conventional Jewish populations and their relatively greater similarity in haplotype profile to non-Jewish Ethiopians are consistent with the view that the Beta Israel people descended from ancient inhabitants of Ethiopia who converted to Judaism. Another 2001 study did, however, find a possible genetic similarity between 11 Ethiopian Jews and 4 Yemenite Jews from the population samples. DNA analysis further determined that modern Jews of the priesthood tribe Kohanim share a common ancestor dating back about 3,000 years. This result is consistent for all Jewish populations around the world. The researchers estimated that the most recent common ancestor of modern Kohanim lived between 1000 BCE and 586 BCE, when the Babylonians destroyed the first temple. They found similar results analyzing DNA from Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews. The scientists estimated the date of the original priest based on genetic mutations, which indicated that the priest lived roughly 106 generations ago, between 2650 and 3180 years ago, depending whether one counts a generation as 25 or 30 years. When Ashkenazi mitochondrial DNA was tested in a large sample, it was found that the 4 main female Ashkenazi founders had descent lines that were established in Europe 10,000 to 20,000 years in the past, while most of the remaining minor founders also have a deep European ancestry. The majority of Ashkenazi maternal lineages were not brought from the Levant, nor recruited in the Caucasus, but were assimilated within Europe. The study estimated that 80% of Ashkenazi maternal ancestry comes from women indigenous to Europe, 8% from the Near East, and the remainder undetermined. According to the study, these findings point to a significant role for the conversion of women in the formation of Ashkenazi communities. A study by Haber et al. Noted that while previous studies of the Levant, which had focused mainly on diaspora Jewish populations, showed that the Jews form a distinctive cluster in the Middle East, these studies did not make clear whether the factors driving this structure would also involve other groups in the Levant. The authors found strong evidence that modern Levant populations descend from 2 major apparent ancestral populations. One set of genetic characteristics which is shared with modern-day Europeans and Central Asians is most prominent in the Levant among Lebanese, Armenians, Cypriots, Druze and Jews, as well as Turks, Iranians and Caucasian populations. The second set of inherited genetic characteristics is shared with populations in other parts of the Middle East as well as some African populations. Levant populations in this category today include Palestinians, Jordanians, Syrians, as well as North Africans, Ethiopians, Saudis, and Bedouins. Concerning this second component of ancestry, the authors remark that while it correlates with a pattern of the Islamic expansion, and that a pre-Islamic expansion Levant was more genetically similar to Europeans than to Middle Easterners, they also say that its presence in Lebanese Christians, Sephardi and Ashkenazi Jews, Cypriots and Armenians might suggest that its spread to the Levant could also represent an earlier event. The authors also found a strong correlation between religion and apparent ancestry in the Levant. All Jews cluster in one branch. Druze from Mount Lebanon and Druze from Mount Carmel are depicted on a private branch. And Lebanese Christians form a private branch with the Christian populations of Armenia and Cyprus, placing the Lebanese Muslims as an outer group. The predominantly Muslim populations of Syrians, Palestinians and Jordanians cluster on branches with other Muslim populations as distant as Morocco and Yemen. A 2013 study by Doron M. Bachor, Matmetz Blub, Yael Baron, Naama M. Koppelman, Bazit Unushbave al. Using integration of genotypes on newly collected largest data set available to date for assessment of Ashkenazi Jewish genetic origins from the regions of potential Ashkenazi ancestry, Europe, the Middle East, and the region historically associated with the Khazar Khaganate, concluded that this most comprehensive study does not change and in fact reinforces the conclusions of multiple past studies, including ours and those of other groups. We confirm the notion that the Ashkenazi, North African, and Sephardi Jews share substantial genetic ancestry and that they derive it from Middle Eastern and European populations, with no indication of a detectable Khazar contribution to their genetic origins. The authors also reanalyzed the 2012 study of Eran el-Haik, and found that the provocative assumption that Armenians and Georgians could serve as appropriate proxies for Khazar descendants is problematic for a number of reasons, as the evidence for ancestry among Caucasus populations do not reflect Khazar ancestry. Also, the authors found that even if it were allowed that Caucasus affinities could represent Khazar ancestry, the use of the Armenians and Georgians as Khazar proxies is particularly poor, as they represent the southern part of the Caucasus region, while the Khazar Khaganate was centered in the North Caucasus and further to the north. Furthermore, among populations of the Caucasus, Armenians and Georgians are geographically the closest to the Middle East, and are therefore expected a priori to show the greatest genetic similarity to Middle Eastern populations. Concerning the similarity of South Caucasus populations to Middle Eastern groups, which was observed at the level of the whole genome in one recent study, the authors found that any genetic similarity between Ashkenazi Jews and Armenians and Georgians might merely reflect a common shared Middle Eastern ancestry component, actually providing further support to a Middle Eastern origin of Ashkenazi Jews, rather than a hint for a Khazar origin. The authors claimed if one accepts the premise that similarity to Armenians and Georgians represents Khazar ancestry for Ashkenazi Jews, then by extension one must also claim that Middle Eastern Jews and many Mediterranean European and Middle Eastern populations are also Khazar descendants. This claim is clearly not valid, as the differences among the various Jewish and non-Jewish populations of Mediterranean Europe and the Middle East predate the period of the Khazars by thousands of years. A 2014 study by Paul et al. Analyzed autosomal SNP data from ftDNA's family finder test for 100 study participants, divided into Jewish, non-Jewish, and interfaith study groups. It reported autosomal DNA test values, such as the size and number of shared DNA segments, the number of genetic matches, and the distribution of predicted relationships, varies between study groups. The study also investigates how shared autosomal DNA and longest block values vary by strength of relationship for each study group. A 2014 study by Kami et al. Published by Nature Communications found that Ashkenazi Jewish population originates from mixing between Middle Eastern and European peoples. According to the authors, that mixing likely occurred some 600 to 800 years ago, followed by rapid growth and genetic isolation. The study found that all Ashkenazi Jews descend from around 350 individuals, and that the principal component analysis of common variants in the sequenced AJ samples confirmed previous observations, namely, the proximity of Ashkenazi Jewish cluster to other Jewish, European and Middle Eastern populations. Geographic distribution. Because of the independence of local communities, Jewish ethnicities, even when they circumscribe differences in liturgy, language, cuisine and other cultural accoutrements, are more often a reflection of geographic and historical isolation from other communities. It is for this reason that communities are referred to by referencing the historical region in which the community cohered when discussing their practices, regardless of where those practices are found today. The smaller groups number in the hundreds to tens of thousands, with the Georgian Jews in Beta Israel being most numerous at somewhat over 100,000 each. Many members of these groups have now emigrated from their traditional homelands, largely to Israel. For example, only about 10% of the Gruzinim remain in Georgia. The Jewish communities of the modern world can all be found represented today in Israel, which is as much a melting pot as it is a salad bowl of different Jewish ethnic groups. A brief description of the extant communities, by the geographic regions with which they are associated, is as follows. Europe Ashkenazi Jews are the descendants of Jews who migrated into northern France and Germany around 800 1000, and later into Eastern Europe. Ashkenazim comprise the overwhelming majority of Jews, with approximately 80% of the Jewish total. Prior to the Holocaust they were an even greater percentage of world Jewry. Among the Ashkenazim there are a number of major subgroups: Western Jews, stemming from northern France, from the lowlands, historical Germany, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Switzerland, and Scandinavia, originally spoke Western Yiddish, which had less Slavic influence than other Yiddish dialects. By the early 20th century, Yiddish was in decline in this population, and assimilation was proceeding rapidly. In Israel, a sometimes derogatory term for these Jews, is Yekus. Oberlander, originating in the Oberland region of Hungary and a district surrounding Bratislava in Slovakia, originally spoke Western Yiddish. In modern times before the Holocaust, many Oberlander Jews migrated to urban centers of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and adopted German or Hungarian as their first language. Polish Jews, from Congress Poland. Galicians from southern Poland and western Ukraine, Hungarians from Hungary, Slovakia and parts of Romania, Lithuanian Jews, southeastern, predominantly from Ukraine, Moldova and Romania, Jews from Udmurtia and Tatarstan. The Ashkenazi Jews on the territory of the Udmurt Republic first appeared in the 1830 years. On the territory of Tatarstan the Ashkenazim began to live in the same period of time. Initially they lived in the vast majority in the workmen's settlement Izhevsky Zavod and the West City Sarapul, as well as in the city Kazan. Jews of these territories were Yiddish-speaking. The local historian and linguist A.V. Altintsev subdivided the Jews of the region on cultural and linguistic characteristics into two territorial groups: 1. Udmurt Jews, who lived on the territory of Udmurtia and the north of Tatarstan. 2. Tatar Jews or Kazan Jews, who lived mainly in the city of Kazan and its agglomeration. The Udmurt Jewry had formed the local idiom, on the base of the Yiddish of Udmurtia till the 1930 years, and features of Yiddish of migrants joined into it. As a result, up to the 1970-80 years the Udmurt idiom was divided into two linguistic subgroups, Center subgroup and Southern subgroup. One of the characteristic features of the Udmurt idiom is a noticeable number of Udmurt and Tatar loan words. For example, Eule herd, flock, troop, drove,